Borders of Migration Studies. I'm Laurence César-Phillips. I'll be chairing this session. Basically, the aim of this session is to hear from colleagues with extensive editorial experience and research experience in the field to give us their reflections on the directions of migration research and gaps in scholarship from their unique vantage points of editors or former editors of journals or book series or special issues or books, outputs basically. So we'll do that. We'll hear from them at the beginning for 5 to 7 minutes each. And then there will be some follow-up questions from the chair in the audience. Yeah, I think that will take us to the hour, basically. I speak quite loudly generally. Can everyone hear me in the back? You're all good. I will assume that our colleagues on Zoom are also able to hear us. So before we start, I'm going to give you some bios. So we'll start. So Professor Carlos Vargas Silva is going to start. He is a professor in migration studies and the director of the Center on Migration Policy and Society at Oxford Campus and a fellow of Keller College. He has a joint appointment between Campus, based at the School of Anthropology and Museum Ethnography, and the Oxford Department for International Development. So his research focuses on the interactions of migration with labor market, public services, and health outcomes, with a focus on the role of policy in affecting those interactions. And he is also the, I'm paraphrasing and really summarizing just for sake of time, but he is the editor-in-chief of the journal Migration Studies, which is published by Oxford University Press. After that, we'll hear from Professor Michaela Benson from Lancaster University. She is a professor in public sociology at Lancaster. She served as editor-in-chief of the Sociological Review between 2016 and 2021. And is associate editor of the journal, was associate editor of the journal's Ethnic and Migration Studies from 2015 until 2017. And she's had many ESRC funded projects, including Brexit and British citizens in the EU, and the current research on Bordering Britain and Britons after Brexit, also known as MIGZEN, with Nando Sigona. And she has published several academic monographs and journal articles in sociology, geography, and migration studies. After that, we will hear from Professor Mette Berg, who is a social anthropologist at UCL, and her research interests are in migration, diasporas and migrant transnationalism, urban diversity, gender belonging and generation, and social memory. She is currently a principal investigator on a Nordforsk funded project on migrants and solidarities, and is the author of Diasporic Generations, Memory, Politics, and Nation Among Cubans in Spain, and has co-edited some monographs as well as special issues, and is in various journals. She is the co-editor of the journal Migration and Society, and also the co-director of the UCL Migration Research Unit. Finally, we will hear from Professor Nando Sigona, who is the director of IRIS, and also a research associate at the University of Oxford's Refugee Studies Center. Yeah. Clearly, I've read this before. So his work most investigates the migration and citizenship nexus, and he is one of the founding editors of Migration Studies. This is an international academic journal published by Oxford University Press, the editor of the book series Global Migration in Social Change by Bristol University Press, and has co-edited a couple of Oxford handbooks on forced migration and refugee studies, and the handbook of Superdiversity, which we've heard about yesterday. Deep breath, and now to our panels. Thank you.
Thank you. Slides. It's great to be invited in this panel, which is very interesting. Today, I'm going to talk about migration studies as a discipline in general, but using the example of the journal that has the same name, the Migration Studies Journal. For those of you that don't know, this is a journal that was launched in around 2011, and it followed a series of conversations between young scholars at Oxford at that point, at around 2009. I should say conversations in different pubs around Oxford with Nando and Alan Gamlem and other people. And the first issue came out in 2013 of the journal. So it has been almost 10 years. We will be celebrating 10 years. And it's a good time, I think, to reflect on what goes into the journal and the trends that we have been seeing. I was an assistant editor of the journal from the beginning, from 2011 to 2020, and I have become the main editor since then. It's the year 2020. During that period, also working with Nando and other people. Now, one question is, what do we have to tell you that you don't know? So people who have been editors of journals. And I think there's one thing. I mean, when you see what journals are publishing, right? Because you are all reading these journals. But as editors, we also see what doesn't get published, right? Papers that are submitted and don't get published. And even for the ones that get published, we see the reaction to these papers of reviewers and other members of the editorial team. So there's a part of the story that I think that we can see as editors that it might not be completely apparent to everyone. Now I'm going to make 5 points, which you can see in the board there. And indeed, here I'm cheating a bit. I'm using slides. I think I'm the only one using slides, but yeah. You will see why. I want to show you some nice tables in a minute. But the first point is that in migration studies, there has been what I call a consolidation of the field. And by this, I mean that there are core concepts that I see people using in the papers, and people from different disciplines using these same core concepts with regards to migration. You also see it in conferences such as this one, where you can see a panel of people, and in that panel you have people from different disciplines, but they can speak to each other because there is some commonality with regards to concepts to migration studies. And I have also seen that over time. If you see this table, just as an example that I wanted to provide, this is I look at the contact authors for the last issue of 2021, and I look at the institutions where those contact authors are based. And you can see a large profile of people from different institutions. And when I talk to people, we know that nowadays the publishing business is related to promotion and all of that. It's very positive to see that a migration journal, which is very specific, can also be used for promotion in different disciplines or to find a job in different disciplines. So I'm very happy to see that variety of topics. The second point, I think this might be a bit controversial, so it would be good to hear from the audience, is that I think over these 10 years that I have been involved with the journal, I think the papers that we receive, which I guess might be reflected of the broader issues of migration, have become more empirical and less conceptual. So there's less emphasis on new conceptual ideas and more emphasis on describing new empirical regularities. There have been also an increase in combining migration with other things. So that's what I call migration and ... Especially in things related to intersectionality have become very popular in submissions to the journal, and this is a trend that I see increasing over time. The other aspect is more comparative research. So, and this is in part driven by the papers we get, but it's also driven by the response of reviewers to those papers. So often there's an emphasis on, the paper has to be comparative in some way. So I see that more and more from reviewers. And then the one that is a bit depressing is that we are forever stuck in the north. And just as an example, this is an analysis of the papers submitted to migration studies to the journal from 2016 to 2021. by the location of the main contact author. And first of all, you can see how just between the US and the UK, you use account for a massive share of the papers, right? For about a quarter of the papers, and these countries, which are mainly high-income countries, will account for a large number of the articles. The rest of the world, so everything else, is just 40% of the articles. And of course, this is just the papers submitted. If I show you the ones that have been accepted, then it becomes more depressing, right? Because there's even a bigger gap in that regard. There are some countries in there. For instance, you have countries such as India in there, but the fact that India is in there is just a reflection of the big share of the population. So next to it, I put essentially papers submitted to migration studies per millions of people, and you can see that the number for India becomes very small. Interestingly, some other countries become very large, like the Netherlands. So apparently they're getting too many papers from the Netherlands. So if there are any Dutch researchers here, yeah, think about it. Yeah. Anyways, with those 5 points, I think that's what I wanted to share with you for introduction.
Thank you very much.
Right, yeah, so I should say, Carlos, I think that there's a general problem, and I think that the pattern that you've identified there matches onto a lot of global north publishing more generally, and it's something that we need to address, I think, as editors and with our publishers as well. So I'm speaking really from a slightly different perspective, which is I'm going to speak predominantly from my experience as the former editor-in-chief of the Sociological Review, which, those of you who don't know it, it's the oldest British journal of sociology. It's been running for 110 years. And as such, it's not really just sociology. It's quite a broad understanding of the sociological imagination. It's historically published a lot of anthropology, for example, and I know there are anthropologists in the audience too. But I just wanted to draw on one point from my experience of being associate editor at GEMS, which might run slightly counter to what Carlos said about the interdisciplinarity. One of the things that really struck me when I was associate editor there was actually the challenges of editing a journal where you're accepting contributions for review from such a broad disciplinary base. So you'd have everything from economics, behavioral psychology, all the way through to the kind of ethnographic, anthropological end of things. And sometimes the concepts coalesce, sometimes they don't, and the methodologies definitely don't. And I think that is something that we need to face as kind of migration finds its way into all of these different disciplinary areas. So I'm just going to offer a few reflections on how the sociology of migration has been developing in the UK. And I'm very pleased to say that it has. One of the things I was told when I first started took my first job after my PhD, having come from a sociology and anthropology background, was that there was no such thing as the sociology of migration. I have a little bit more sympathy for that position, having worked in this area now for a longer time, because I think what I was being told was actually we have other concepts that we're more familiar with that we use to talk about some of these things. And obviously the go-to there is around the sociology of race and ethnicity and citizenship, which I think is obviously a very, very prominent theme. But I think that what this means is that when migration comes into sociology, it can be variously positioned. It might find itself in work on class, as it did originally in the early days, because it was all concerned with like questions of labor and things like that. But increasingly, we're seeing it feature in all sorts of different subfields within sociology, which I think is quite productive as a way forwards. But I think that what Carlos has observed in respect to migration studies is also true in the kind of sociology of migration. There's a lot of empirical research, all of which is very valuable in developing our understandings of what's happening. But the theoretical and conceptual conversations don't seem to be moving at the same pace. And I think that's something to be addressed going forwards. It often fits into established fields. There's a lot of stuff in urban sociology which sits with the superdiversity theme, for example, race and ethnicity, and around gender and citizenship. The recent trend towards bordering, I think, has really taken off in sociology. So particularly the work derived from Neri Yuval Davis around that kind of new moment, that neoliberal moment, and what that means around some of the things that Colin was talking about, actually around deputization of borders to individuals and their role in the everyday. And I'm seeing that increasingly in papers published across British sociology journals. And I apologize for the fact that it's very British centric, this, but actually that does reflect how the field is shaped a little bit. The politics of migration and belonging and identity remain really steadfast within this field of research. But one area that I think is really exciting is work that I think is focused on temporality. And that can be anything from waiting, which I know is a really, really big anthropological theme, to those kinds of understandings of the kind of the length of stay and what that means for our questions around how people engage with in the places that they live in various ways, which might be referred to as embedding, might in other disciplinary areas be talked about in terms of kind of social integration and things like that. But there are hot spots and then there are blind spots. Sorry, I'm stealing your words. So there are some real hot spots, particularly in the sociology of migration. And you can see how that sociological research has followed a policy agenda. So, sorry, that's my watch telling me I've spoken for 4.5 minutes. So there's a huge volume of work. We did a review article, Nando, myself, Catherine and Eleanor, who are in the audience recently, which shows exactly the volume of research we have with Polish communities in the UK and how this massively outweighs research with any other EU community in the UK. For example, the volume of research on asylum seekers and refugees, very important work, it's all there, but there are notable absences. Now, of course, I'm going to say this, I'm an expert in British immigration. There aren't very many of us, but there was a point in time where the conversations around migration were about migration to and from the UK and within the UK. And that from and that within has gone. It's not really there. And I think that this is really, it's kind of interesting in terms of, if we're thinking about how we reshape conversations around migration, I think actually starting to think about our complicity in reconstructing and reinforcing the borders, particularly at this political moment in the UK, is really important. But I also do want to reflect on the where of our research. There is a lot of research based in Britain, increasingly in Northern Europe, and we are seeing research being published in UK scholarship on kind of comparative cases, but not, like, again, in the kind of hotspots. So we do get articles that are about the US-Mexico border, which you would expect, and a little bit around the border, you know, the Mediterranean borders. But yeah, I think it's also about looking at where we're not getting, what we're not hearing. And of course, we have to locate that in the broader map of publishing. But yeah, in rural areas, I would say that there's a massive, overwhelming focus on the urban. And we're not necessarily asking the same questions of what's happening in respect to migration in rural areas. So I will stop.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, so I'm going to speak as the co-editor of Migration and Society. We're much newer than these two distinguished journals that we've heard from you launched in 2018. And some of the things that perhaps distinguish Migration and Society from the others is that we're very much trying to reach across humanities and social sciences. So we have a section which is called Creative Encounters. We feature poetry. We also feature a wider range of formats of writing. So we have interviews, for example, roundtables. We also have short reflections, either on field work. We have quite a lot of those. It's quite a popular section to submit to. And we also have reflections on teaching and on kind of our practice as migration scholars. we're really keen to try and do something about this forever stock in the north that Cameras has also talked about. But it's really difficult. It's a real challenge, and we do try and be proactive. We are committed to being proactive, reaching out to scholars in the south, but there are lots and lots of barriers to overcome. But I think it's something we could all think about when we in our work and our practice, and people who work with scholars from the south, thinking about how we can support. I'm really pleased that so Migration and Society is published by Berg. She's a value-driven publisher and has quite an innovative open access model. It's called Subscribe to Open, so we don't charge author processing charges, which is one of the many barriers also to scholars from the south. Okay, so having said all that, I've just come back from Stockholm. I've been in Stockholm for the past 2 days. It was an interesting time to go to Sweden just on the heels of the really depressing election result there. So I just wanted to say a little bit about that, because being there, I wasn't really in Stockholm. I was at Stockholm University at a migration conference, but being there really made me reflect on the sort of the wider landscape and environment and context that we are doing work on migration in. For a while, it's been, I think it's fair to say, it's been a difficult and hostile and turbulent times to be working on migration, and also for migrants across Europe and much of the world. And I think the election results with the high turnout and votes for the Sweden Democrats really exemplify that. And I was really struck being at this conference that I met a junior postdoctoral colleague who was working at Stockholm University, and who was essentially telling me she wanted to leave Sweden. She didn't feel that there was a place for her in Sweden anymore as a Muslim scholar of migration. And but she had was concerned because of the passport that she held, not an EU passport, and how was she going to be able to find a job somewhere else. So they're really difficult times. On the same day, another colleague in a discussion, a more senior white male colleague expressed his concerns about expectations that he felt were increasingly under as migration scholars, that we should be working with and collaborating with migrant organizations. And he felt that this was a slippery slope, which would compromise the scientific nature of our research. And he asked, I think genuinely, actually, not just rhetorically, how we could be sure that migrant organizations were not Muslim extremists, as he put it. And so, yeah, so the turbulence is all around us, and it's also within our research communities. And yeah, something I certainly has been troubling me, and that I hope we can reflect on. And I'd welcome conversation about how to respond to the ever more hostile politics and policies around migration. What can we do as scholars about the suspicion and dehumanization that migrants are subject to, the language of burden around people seeking asylum? And so this is something I really welcome more work on. Like others, I've had ambiguous feelings about the proclaimed open arms towards Ukrainians in this country, while also wondering what will happen when the immediate enthusiasm dies down and the support for the private hosting scheme in this country runs out. And so this has just been a very kind of a jarring sense of how different people who are differently racialized are received and welcomed or not. And so when I read an interview with Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie in the Financial Times in May, her words resonated. She said, so this was when the immigration and nationality bill was going through Parliament. She said, "Can I just say it's really unconscionable that the British government is welcoming refugees from Ukraine, as it should, but then it's shipping others to Rwanda. I just think, why isn't there outrage about that in the world? As an end of quote. And so I thought that maybe that's what we should do, research with outrage. And so I was thinking about this, but then wise colleagues of mine said to me that actually there's quite a lot of outrage in the world already, and maybe that's not what we need more of. So what then? And so I just wanted to share with you some of my reflections on this, and I don't have answers really. I'm really grasping here, but I think that it's the issue we're thinking about. So Jonathan Darling has argued for what he calls a cautious politics of humanization, and he's called on us to denounce the language of burden in which asylum policy is discussed as a neutral technical question of resource allocation. And by politics of humanization, he refers to a politics that avoids representing people seeking asylum in a reductionist way and according to a singular normative account of the human. So he's very aware that, that there's also, we have to be careful when we talk about humanizing, that we're not also then ending up essentializing. And so to humanize in this sense would be to focus on human experience as fragmentary, incoherent, and resistant to clear categorization. Now, in the inaugural issue of Migration and Society in 2018, so in the kind of the aftermath of the so-called migration crisis of 2015, Elena Fidian-Kazmi and I wrote about the importance of historicizing dynamics of hospitality and hostility towards migrants and refugees, and how we can benefit from empirically and theoretically grounded scholarship that shows the social embeddedness of nuances and ambiguities of situated practices of hospitality and hostility. This can open up the possibility of imagining and embodying what Elisabeth Povinelli has called the otherwise, forms of life that are at odds with dominant and dominating modes of being. And grounding encounters of hospitality and hostility, we can start asking questions such as, who has or assumes the right to act as host, in what contexts and on what social grounds? Who is recognized as guest and who is turned away, by whom and on what grounds? And so to answer these questions, we need to consider issues of gender, class, ethnicity, race, age, sexuality, citizenship, and legal status, among others. And we need to think of relationships and social actors, power and hierarchies, but also of agency and modes of resistance. And I'd really like to see more work on that. And so this could be maybe one way of channeling outrage. Sorry, how am I doing for time?
I'm a bit over time.
Okay, oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, so so anyway, so this is an invitation to do, I'm sure I'm not the only one who has this sense of outrage, but how can we channel it and what can we do about it? I just wanted to say very briefly at the end, a couple of areas of work that I would also invite more, love to see more on. So a growing body of work that has brought a focus on race, racism and racialization into conversation with migration and diversity scholarship. I think that's really welcome and refreshing. I think there's still lots to do in terms of decolonizing our disciplines and our methods towards less hierarchical and extractive research encounters. I'd like to see more on that. I think the trend towards ever more differentiations of labels and legal statuses is something we also really need to work more on. And then my final point, but I think I've already addressed it, this is about the forever stuck in the north, as Carlos put it, but also in terms of, it's important that we think about how can we diversify and make our community of scholars more diverse, more inclusive of people with different backgrounds. And so, thank you. Sorry. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Shall I go?
Oh, yeah, please go.
Yeah. So I'm talking from as editor of the Global Migration Social Change book series. You saw some of the book in the atrium there, here. One of the things that I think is really important is already starting to emerge in the last 5 years, 5-6 years, is more attention to the politics of knowledge production in migration and on migration and in migration studies. Just to give you an example, not about the 3 points that were pointed out before. We can move to the next one. So the fact that the Netherlands produce a lot of migration research, very interesting. The second point is about the dominance of empirical research in migration journals. And the third point is about this idea of where the authors are located. And these are very much to do with the politics of knowledge production. The Netherlands is a country that's really scored very highly on European funding for research on migration in particular, so the Horizon project, much more in relation to the population size. It's also where the English is spread as a language of academia for longer time than in other places. So it's not surprising that it would be interesting to compare the production of migration studies in Dutch and in English, for example, from Dutch scholars. One would be the second point about the empirical research. You can link it, would be my guess, to, especially when it comes to British academia, to the pressure we are under to the REF. The REF is the research exercise that we do regularly, no? So we submit some publication. One of the criteria for those publications is methodological rigor. Conceptual articles tend to score very low because they don't really have a empirical base on which they're based. So a lot of people are pushed to produce a lot of articles with a lot of empirical data. And it's so the politics of knowledge production and migration has been shaped. And the third point was about, and it's something that we all struggle, no? The fact that in Global South, we don't get the author of the Global South, people, it's very hard to engage. So it would be more interesting to see that first, a lot of the data we have is where are the institutions where people are based in. A lot of, if you look more in detail, you will notice that a lot of the people working on migration, they have some kind of migration background, some stories of migration that will be somewhere. So you probably get a less negative picture if you think that the dimension of where someone is from, like a place of birth, is so important to understand the voice from the South. The problem also with the authors based in the Global South institutions is that probably even if you find an author, they may not be able to afford the book that they cost £175 when they come out, or they may not have a subscription with a journal where you expect them to submit. So there are issues that are also very much material issues related to, so we can make all the effort we want, but then if the people cannot even circulate the article they publish, because no one can read unless they can sort of do copies. So we need to think about this dimension. In terms of can you go first? We go. Just briefly about the book series, we published 12 books to date. The first one was published in 2018 and was a book by Ala Sirie called The Politics of Compassion, which was looking at responses to various forms of refugee crisis across a number of case studies internationally. We have just published three articles in the last month or so, and we got three books and 3 more coming out in 2012. One of as I pointed out about the knowledge production and access to the cost, as well as interesting, this book come out in hardback, in ebook format at the cost of a paperback, but increasingly, I was talking with the editor yesterday that paperback that become more frequent, so as well lower the price, partly because the publishing environment is changing overall. The way that the book the book production works, there is a submission of a proposal, there is a screening process by the editor, then it goes for review as a proposal, and if it's contracted, then it goes for a review as a full text. So he has got this double process of reviewing. And what we do when we did the first call for book proposal, we list a series of topics that we felt were particularly interesting at the time. And this was already around 2017 when we left 5 years ago. And this were the topic we asked people to think about. So there was, I think, a lot around thinking of migration, not just through a migration lens, so to connect with citizenship at the time. So the migration and citizenship nexus, to explore to what extent the governance on migration tell us also to the way the society overall is changing, is redefining what does it mean to be a subject, a citizen, in the way that you govern the bodies of the migrants as well. we emphasized, we looked at, as has been pointed out, that the border and bordering has been now already for a number of years a central topic of interest. However, there is also an interesting because indicate over-representation of the arrival stage in the study of migration at the moment. So everyone focused, other than crossing the border, the border that's controlled within the countries, but more or less focused on the initial stage. While what is interesting and is looking through a longer term perspective, may also be interesting how the bordering practice change in relation to different life stages of people, but also over time. The other key topics were to bring in back, in a sense, something that has been for a number of years, the transnationalism and diaspora, also for an institutional lens, but partly because, the next one of the concerns that we had is this idea that also, as Michaela pointed out, the fact that when we talk about migration studies, we talk about the reality of immigration studies in most circles. We did with some of my master's students, we did a very sort of superficial review of all the main migration journals. A couple of years ago, we published blogs in which we are mapping what they published in the last 5 years and looking at the origin of the authors, where they were from, the keywords they were using, and try to capture what people are publishing about in the journal. And you can really see those gaps we mentioned before, the blind spots in the literature. And in particular, there is this. And what is also interesting is the terms we use. I mean, all the conference has been out around terminologies and the labels. People talk about migrants, but they're talking about immigrants. And it's really interesting that while I can understand that some people use the term migrants because they feel is less charged, is a bit like when you use the term refugees for everyone, even if someone has not a refugee status. I can understand the political statement, but it's also something that erase or hide some other aspect, because it is basically, you don't like the fact that in the end, you're just looking at the immigrants, often from the perspective of the state that receive them, and through the research question and the research priorities of the receiving states. I'll stop here, even if I had many more, but we haven't got the time. You got it.
So I think we've had very insightful insights. That works really well. So brilliant insights on your experience and where you see the current state and the future state of migration research and the challenges that are there. Thank you. So I'll invite the responses from the floor. Also, something that we've not really discussed and probably won't because it would take too long is talking about reviewers. But please.
It's just because something just occurred to me while we were talking about. I'm part of a collective of feminist editors that started up, and it's a collective that is actually includes quite a lot of editors from the global south. And this has been really interesting actually in terms of those conversations about how you get scholarship in the global south. And I think that this goes to the heart of some of the things that have really opened my eyes over the last few years working as an editor, which are actually, you know, we imagine this kind of global ecosystem. Obviously, we know there's a hegemony of knowledge in the north, all of these kinds of things. But one of the things that's happened as well in some areas of the global south is they've developed their own alternatives to what we do, and actually they have possibly slightly less commoditized processes of publishing in academic journals, all of those kinds of things. So it is also worth looking at what else is out there. But there's one of the challenges of being an editor is there's very rarely opportunities like this where you sit together with other editors and actually talk about it, so you're not sharing practice from that point of view. In terms of internationalization, from the point of view of the Sociological Review, we invested a lot of time in trying to do this. We work very closely with lots of ECRs, and we have writing retreats. We have a whole series of online events where we bring people together to to talk through internationalization things. The current editor has worked very, very hard on internationalization, particularly towards China, and has done lots of work. So there's lots of Chinese resources there, and we've started to try and publish things through some of our other. We've got a broader publishing platform as well. It's not just the journal, where we try to bring in other languages as well. But it comes with significant challenges. and it is a lot of time and work. And we're also working with instructors, and I think this is the other important thing to bear in mind. All of us, that our publishing experience, our editorial experiences, was working with academic publishers, and that's a whole other layer of things that you have to manage and negotiate with. They can sometimes be really useful. So in terms of like subscription packages and exemptions from APCs, as Berg have done there, they're part of that ecosystem that we have to negotiate with in order to open up spaces. But I think that's the bit that people can tend to forget as well.
Well, and one thing also, again, Sunday Nando was saying, I mean, we have the journal available in all low-income countries for free. So they do get to read it, but how do you include authors? What we are doing now, but it also relates to one of the comments, is somebody submits a special issue, and we have said the special issue, then you ask that person, right, to include people, right, to have a broader group of people, including people from the global south, but then you go back to the idea that, you know, if the special issue is being edited by people with fewer resources and so on, they will be dedicating a lot of their time to that. But I think there's no other option, because getting this to some level requires somebody. It could be the special issue editor, it could be directly the main editor, but somebody will have to dedicate a lot of time, and there's no way around it. The other thing that I try to do is we have one article per issue, which is the editor's choice. So you can use that once the paper is accepted, right? You can use that a bit strategically to select someone and increase representation. Then one final comment about, I guess, defending journals, editors in general, about the lack of communication. I'm sure Sociological Review, for instance, is a lot more articles. We get about 500 articles, right, per year. And the possibility that you will reply to concerns about rejections and so on is very small. I personally never reply, so everyone thinks their paper is a great one that was rejected by mistake.
I think all the barriers and so on have been outlined really well. So we do try to be really supportive, and we do reply. So we have fewer submissions, but it's incredibly time consuming, and it's also really difficult because once you've seen a couple of iterations of a paper and you can see it's improving, but you also have to be really realistically, is this going to get to a publishable stage? And it becomes more and more difficult then to turn around and say in the end, sorry, we can't take it. So it's a balancing act, but really commendable what you've done. And and we try and do with special issues, we try and say you should, to the issue guest editors, please try and include at least one article from Global South. We try and encourage more co-authors, because often there are people working together on research projects, but also in citation, be inclusive in your citation practices. So there are lots of different stages at which you can be more inclusive, and on all of them, I hope will contribute something.
From the point of view of book series, what we're doing is most of the authors we have published to date have either a migration heritage or migration background. I mean, a large majority. We're trying to get people from. We're trying to also to reach out. Targeting people, so we have a network of editorial board to which we get in touch and ask to recommend if there is any sort of early career researcher that has got a fantastic thesis. Can you recommend? Or people can sort of so it's not just about. There is also an issue. Okay, it's not just about the people that submit the proposal directly, because there are people who are very confident and people are very insecure, and there is gender, there is class, there is a lot of things that intervene about how confident you are about your research that maybe has nothing to do with the quality in some cases. So I think this way of accessing, because for example, Cecilia sent us some proposal. Said you're publishing one of the next books coming out early next year is from a Zimbabwean scholar based in Zimbabwe, writing about the South African-Zimbabwe border, for example. Specifically, One thing which I wanted to mention is this one problematic part of this is the open access issue, because sometimes we don't think about it. I don't know if you're familiar with the way we work in many UK university. Now there is open access has become almost a requirement for having your work assessed and valued. However, would they say that you have access to open access only if you can request open access only if you are the main author of the paper. You have to be the author, the correspondence author. And this actually, in large projects that can be international, involving also people in global south, means that in many cases, people tend to become a way, in a sense, to restrict access for those people based in university that don't have the funding to afford the kind of resources. So it's quite interesting also, again, even terms that should be, the direct meaning is about let's open up, let's make knowledge available, become a way to further exclude some. So one of my main goals in terms of the future, this idea of it's really to take a much more critical and reflexive practice in the way we produce our knowledge, and not basically keep it always in mind, even when we're working on a specific case study, because it really helps to problematize some of the assumption that otherwise they just get forgotten in the everyday pressure that we are under.
Also, I think when that practice also potentially excludes people from first authorship as well, and from early career or so less experience in publishing. So that has some consequences that maybe they have not been thought about.
But I think that's Michaela's point is really important. That it's also because journals are increasingly published by commercial publishers. They're making money out of this, and we are providing all of our free labor.
Yeah.
You know, we are, so as editors, it's mainly free labor, peer review, free labor. It's really problematic.
Can I just add one point in on that? So there is a particularly UK issue related to that, which is that if you're funded by UKRI, you have to publish open access. So you have to use those particular forms, and that means that it kind of almost forces you into those boxes and channels that way. So that's also the funders that start to come into it all.
Well, we'll get the second one about the migration field. Well, there are different perspectives. From my perspective, that's the way probably that it should be, right? The migration people should be together, and if they're from different disciplines talking in the same panel, for me that would be something good, right? That's a positive angle. But I agree with you. Then that means that the different migration people are talking with each other, and perhaps there is some interaction with other people. Now, the other question with the other point about whether climate migration experts wants to publish their paper in Nature versus a migration studies journal. I think if you have a paper that is good for Nature, go ahead and publish it in Nature, right? That's a very specific type of journal. But if you have something that talks to migration in general, that's the kind of journal that I guess kind of paper that will be more suitable for a migration study. So not everything in migration would fit in a migration studies journal.
Yeah. Let me start go back to so the geography. That's really interesting. So I'm a social anthropologist, and I very much recognize what you're describing, but from some years ago in anthropology. And so what's happened in anthropology is, I think, migration has become more kind of mainstream, and so it's not relegated anymore. So I'm actually really surprised to hear that's happening in geography. So I don't know what's going on, but it might be a bit of what Carlos says, and maybe sometimes it's quite good you get to talk to other migration scholars, but maybe, yeah, I wonder if there's also going to be kind of some movement and dynamic there that it changes.
It's not what also you wrote in the chapter on anthropology, spread diversity. How migration scholars are discriminated also in anthropology.
Yeah, I think, yeah, no, I think historically, exactly. So yeah, so yes, I've written about it in a book chapter in this handbook of Superdiversity, but I think it has changed. Yeah, so I wonder, is it going to change, or what's happening in geography? I don't know. But there's so much interesting work on migration happening in geography. So I'm really surprised. I think geography is lost, I would say. But yeah, and your question, working with migrant organizations. So I think, so my experience is that it is incredibly enriching and mutually beneficial, but it is also, there are lots of barriers to working with migrant organizations, because they are strapped for resources, for money, for time, and so on. So you have to find mutually respectful and beneficial ways of working. But I find it's really enriching, and it's really helpful for us as scholars to hear from people with ear on the ground, and also to think about how can we present our research in ways that are more accessible and so on. So, but I think there's a lot, and you can really learn from it. So, yeah.
I just want to say on this issue around open access, it's a really, really tricky one. I think it's not an either or. I think we have to be open to both possibilities. And we also have to remember that we're also caught in that weird dynamic as well, which is that actually there are people who desperately want to publish in global north journals because of the reputational, unfortunately, the reputational weight that gives them and the credentialization that does. So we have to be aware of that as well. But I did just want to highlight that we're not the only ecosystem of publishing. There are others, and actually we've got a lot to learn from. I mean, honestly, some of these feminist journal editors from Latin America and from Africa have really disrupted all understandings of open access that we might have held, because they weren't bound in the same ways we were to commercial publishers.
So they teach us as opposed to us. So this can be.
But we have to find the spaces where we can have those kinds of conversations and recognize the difference in the structures. And you know, if anybody's ever tried to move their journal from a commercial publisher to something else, which we did at one stage consider with Sociological Review, self-publishing, it's almost impossible, because we don't have all of the structures that you actually need to support publishing are all owned by the publishers. So it's almost impossible at this point in time, unless you're in a big consortium. There's a big anthropology consortium, for example, that have a big open access thing, and there are a couple of geography journals as well. But yeah, we're really sorry. This is not about the future of migration research. It's more about
It's the future of publishing.
the future of academic publishing. But yeah, there are lots of big challenges ahead.
I would just like to point out the working with migrant organizations and something about unusual formats in writing, which is interesting, because we have a huge push about experimenting new ways of communicating research, working across discipline involving humanities and social science, and or working with migrants, do events. Then you don't really have how to translate these things into an article, or journals don't really have necessarily, not all journals, very few journals will have actually a way of publishing that material. So there is somehow a gap that we need to reflect how to fill in, and at the moment is a problem. So you have people investing a lot in participatory research. You know, let's work. We do a lot of work with Jenny, also with young people, young unaccompanied minors. And the traditional journal article is not something was possible to come out, but you also have to think about maybe not the best way, because the other thing we have to think about, there is a lot of, from a point of view of migrant organization, having an academic article in a journal that is read by 120 people, or even 1,000, is not necessarily giving back to them. It's actually something that makes our conscience better. So you need to be more creative. And the key point is actually to start the conversation very early on about how we can sort of establish a dialogue. What is the best thing for you? Could there be a policy report in which we discuss how to translate the findings of the research we did together in something that you can use for advocacy, for example? So in a sense, that is a process that you have to engage from the beginning rather than just the publication in a traditional sense.
All right, I'll have to close this session. Thank you so much to our panel and to our